And we'll start in the afternoon session with some of the other tables contributing. What you've spent the last 15 minutes talking about, just because we didn't hear you stand up and make an intervention now, this is what the folks from CIRA at your table are for. This is what the writing is down for, and perhaps you can tack some more things up on the wall. It's just to go through 12 tables. We do have a luncheon speaker we've got to hit some time for. We have one more presentation as well before we get going. So thank you for tables 1 through 4. That was all great, and I'm glad we had that contributions from all of you. Thank you very much. And tables 5 through 12, you've got something to come up to in a bit. So thank you, everybody. Okay, at this point in time, I do want to call Byron back up to the stage. He has some, what I'll call Canadian color to our earlier discussion with a report on some recent research that CIRA has conducted. And I think you'll find this useful as good context for lunch and for our afternoon discussion. So, Byron.
Thank you very much for all the work you've done here. I just want to reiterate the fact that even those who haven't spoken, all of the work that you do at your table is captured by our staff members, and what we do with that is integrated into a single report that we will then turn around in the near future and make publicly available to all. So the work you're doing here absolutely will see the light of the day for the whole Canadian internet community. You know, that said, we have shared a lot of opinions here. A lot of opinions and perspectives on complex issues with many, many moving parts. You know, we've heard about WSIS, we've heard about the IANA stewardship transition, and other forums that the panel spoke about that will be happening through the course of the year. But really the fundamental questions that we also talked a bit about were, who makes the decisions? How are they made? What exactly are they? And a lot of these issues are not necessarily or even particularly new issues. We've discussed them before, both here at previous CIFs, as well as in the various global fora. You know, in fact, at the last CIF, we had quite a robust discussion about the IANA stewardship transition. It was fairly new and hot off the press, and then there was a lot of discussion about that. We've heard previously about CIF participants, you know, their overwhelming, or your overwhelming support for the multi-stakeholder model in general. The fact that it needs to be totally inclusive with civil society, academia, technical community, and most assuredly governments. So we as a community have voiced those opinions that we need a system that kind of can encompass the various cultural differences and values that make up the Canadian population and the global population as well. What we want to do now is recognize that there are many different opinions, that governments need to play a role, but not necessarily politics or politicking, or at least as much as possible keep it to a minimum. But what we want to do now is share some of what I'm going to call less opinion, but facts and figures based on survey work that CIRA did recently. So we polled Canadians, sample set of 1,000, so statistically significant and relevant, and we looked at a number of key questions, and we wanted to share that with you today to give you a sense of, from a statistical point of view, what are Canadians thinking about some of the big picture issues. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. We do have the full report published online, and I would encourage you to go take a look at it because it goes into significantly more detail than I will do here. I promise you, I won't take too long on stats and facts, but I think there's a few that we should talk about. And the first, if I could get the slide up, talks about, pardon me, well, I'll let you read for yourself. Should Canada's leaders should make connecting as much of the global population to the internet as possible a top priority in international affairs. I think that's a key criteria right there. So as part of our, let's call it foreign policy or posture in the world, should we make connecting as many people globally as possible one of the key planks? And you can see here that is a very, very strong majority who actually believe that that should be one of Canada's fundamental tenets. And I think part of it, there's no doubt, as you unpack the data, there's some altruism behind this. And certainly as a Canadian, I'd like to think that. But of course, there's also self-interest here. The more people that are online, the better it is for the whole internet ecosystem from a communications, commercial, cultural standpoint. So as a key data point, Canadians are saying part of our policy environment should be an effort to connect as many global citizens as possible. And I think that's a really interesting and meaningful perspective from the Canadian population. The next data point that I wanted to bring to your attention is around individual countries. Should individual countries or jurisdictions be able to control what their citizens see or post online? So now we bring it closer to home. And while we can always point to some faraway land and talk about the things that they do or shouldn't do, what do we as Canadians feel about that? And quite frankly, there's a solid majority who believe that should not be the case, but it's still only 60%, roughly. 40% of folks feel that individual countries or governments should be able to, in a sense, control content to some degree. You know, and I think this actually is very topical right now. Many of you will probably have seen the recent news that the Quebec government is asking the ISPs in Quebec to prevent the delivery of any gaming sites to Quebec residents other than Lotto Quebec gaming sites. So you have a very we're not going to stop on this one. I'll let you talk about that amongst yourselves. But this is not other governments in faraway lands doing nefarious things. We have a government right here in Canada who's potentially engaged in this exact activity right now. So it's very relevant, but you can start to see that Canadians are a little more split. Still a solid majority saying that the governments shouldn't be limiting content, but it's a much finer split than the previous one. So we move to the next slide. This asks the questions about whether there should be more control by individual countries or more multinational control in terms of global standards. Again, back to, should countries really control the standard, or should it be a broad global standard? And you can see here we're actually completely evenly split. And I actually thought this was an interesting one. I would have assumed that it would have been much stronger for broad global consensus in terms of standards. But quite evenly split, though when you get to particular standards themselves from a technology standpoint, so one is more from a governance and policy standpoint, and the other is from a technology standpoint, that one does split to more folks, 65%, believing that technology standards versus policy and governance standards should be done more at a global level. But we can see Canadians are unsure here where to go in terms of governance and policy. Should it be just us, or should we be part of a larger global ecosystem? Here we can see Canadians are pretty evenly divided on whether more or less private sector involvement is best for the internet. But they are definitely leaning towards less involvement from government. And again, we can see here a duality there. Canadians in general, when you unpack some of the evidence behind this particular slide, are somewhat concerned about the influence that private sector actors have. As you know, are they watching us online? What are they doing with that data? How come this ad for a pair of boots or a car that I looked at is following me all over the internet? So there is some concern about that, but there is a pretty solid majority of Canadians who believe that there should be less government involvement in how we use the internet. So we have, I think it's interesting, in this audience, we have a significant number of policymakers, government officials, as well as private sector actors and civil society. So, I think for this afternoon, too, the idea is that some of this data can seed the conversation for this afternoon, and you can talk with your policymakers at your table about some of this information. So that gives, I think, a little bit of a sense of some of the key big picture data points around what Canadians are thinking are some of the big issues. And I think these are very relevant as we go forward because, the internet obviously, as we've talked about, is one of the greatest drivers of social change, of commercial change, of commerce in Canada. Its percentage of the overall Canadian economy continues to grow. I think it's only maybe 3 years ago, it was about 3% of the Canadian economy. Now it's more than 7%. So very significant growth and therefore importance in the commerce of Canada. And how Canadians are responding to that and what they're thinking about is very important for policymakers to weigh as they, in fact, as Bill Clinton said, stumble forward in some of this uncharted terrain. So I know I'm the only thing that is separating you from lunch. I just wanted to share some of those key high-level observations from our survey of Canadians. I would encourage you to go on our website and you can find the full report which drills down into a lot more detail. So I believe lunch will be out very shortly. And we'll give you time to get started with lunch, and then we will have our keynote speaker, who we're actually really excited to have today. So thank you very much, and enjoy lunch, and we'll get back shortly.